They weren't planning on having to trade me back. They had other plans for me. Things Shan just barely managed to stop from happening. It meant I survived. It also meant I got to see some things. Things I wasn't supposed to see. Or things I wasn't supposed to see and live to tell about it. Here's what I know. The Mosaics have been created. They've bred. And the Trumpet is on its way. This is Spines. You've already heard from Shan how I was taken. 1 minute I was walking across the street. The next I was suspended in the middle of a clear, shiny bubble, like Glinda the goddamn witch. That bubble didn't respond to anything I tried. Not slowing time, not matter manipulation, teleporting, nothing worked. I could still do all of those things inside the bubble, but I couldn't make contact with the walls. They just flexed and shied away from me as I rose into the air, as it took me away. I fought, but at a certain point, I just stopped and I watched Shan's face until they disappeared. For a long time, I was up in the clouds. I couldn't tell how fast I was moving, how far I was going. Turns out it was several thousand miles, which means I must have been moving faster than a jet. It got cold up there, but the bubble must have insulated me somehow. I would have frozen to death otherwise. After a while, the bubble started to descend. I could make out a city beneath me, something hot and sun-baked and unfamiliar. Later, I found out it was Madrid, but I wouldn't find that out until after the trade. The bubble carried me down toward the roof of a warehouse. Something remote and removed from the main part of the city. I thought we were going to crash into the building, but the bubble just passed through the rooftop like it was water. It carried me down through layers of pink insulation, stucco, pipes, wooden ceiling beams. I emerged into a room with bright blue light. One entire wall was clear plexiglass, and behind that were banks of computers and people bent over screens. There was this kind of booth on the other side of the room with someone strapped into a chair. They had electrodes attached to their skull. I think they might have actually been in their skull. I think that was the gifted who was controlling the bubble, although they weren't really conscious, I don't think. In the middle of the floor was a sunken area, like an empty swimming pool. Set into the floor of that sunken area were 2 metal trapdoors, each about 6 feet across. The people behind the plexiglass saw me, but they weren't surprised. They'd obviously expected for me to come floating down through the ceiling in a giant bubble, which pretty much told me who they were. I screamed and struggled and tried lashing out with my gifts again, but they didn't speak to me or pay attention. They knew I couldn't do anything. They were confident in their captured gifted's ability to imprison me. Time passed. I don't know how long. Maybe an hour. It was hard to tell in the bubble. They kept working at their computers and workstations, kept speaking and gesturing to each other, ignoring me. And finally, they all gathered at the plexiglass and watched the sunken room. Nothing happened at first, but then things started to move. It all started without warning, without a countdown or a big red light or anything. The metal doors just flipped open, and it started. Keep in mind that I didn't know what they were at the time. I was just floating there, trying to understand what I saw. So I'll tell you the way I saw it before I understood. The things that climbed out of the pits were fleshy, with muscles and soft, hairless skin like moles. They were obviously mammalian, I guess, even though I'd never seen anything like them. But their shapes were all wrong, not like any warm-blooded creature I'd ever seen. There were two. One was shaped almost like a giant crab, with a flat, disc-like body and 6 scuttling legs. And on top of that flat body were 2 sets of eyes. They were compound eyes, like when you see a close-up of a fly and there are hundreds of tiny dots making up a bigger eye. Except these compound eyes were different. Each one had 8 pieces instead of hundreds. And those pieces were different colors. Blue, brown, green, gray. Human eyes in blinking clusters, staring out from the back of this inhuman thing. It was horrible. The other one was smaller. It had an entirely different shape. I would have taken these 2 creatures for totally unrelated species, except both had that warm-looking skin stretched over an arachnid frame. This one was long-bodied, skeletal, about 7 feet long with 10 or 12 sets of little legs. It had no eyes that I could see, compound or otherwise. It did, though, have a small orifice on the front of that long torso. And when that orifice opened, I saw pearl-colored human teeth. Yeah. These things crawled out of their pits and circled each other. They just completely ignored me and were focused on each other. They came close enough to almost bump noses or whatever they had instead of noses. Then they hopped away from each other, and the big one raised 2 of its legs like it was ready to fight. They kept doing that, coming close, darting away, testing each other. Even though they never looked at me, never paid attention to me, I was more scared of those things than I have been of anything in my short life. I didn't need to see them do anything. They didn't need to come after me for me to understand how wrong these things were. And all the while this horrible thing is unfolding in front of me, the people behind the plexiglass just watched and took notes and checked their computer screens. Whatever this obscenity was, it was going the way they planned. At least, then it was. At last, the big, crab-like one turned its back on the smaller one and hunkered down low on the floor. The other one, the one that was more like a centipede, inched closer and closer. It stopped still just before it reached the big one. And this happened so fast I almost couldn't see it. Its tail whipped over its back, past its head like a scorpion stinger. That stinger stabbed right into the big one's back, and blood started oozing out and onto the floor. They stayed still like that, with the stinger of one embedded in the back of the other. The big one didn't fight or struggle, it just quivered and sat there. And then, just as quickly as it had struck, the stinger pulled out, and the smaller one tipped over on its side on the floor. The big one stood and shook itself off. Blood was still oozing from the wound on its back, but it didn't seem like a serious puncture. It turned back toward the centipede. And then the big one, the crab one, opened a mouth that I hadn't realized was there before. This mouth that extended across the width of its entire body. And then it just ate the flesh of its cellmate. The entire body of the smaller one was gone in a minute. And then there was just this one heaving, breathing, surviving creature. Just that one and me. The moment this thing ate the last shred of the other's flesh, it started sniffing around and nosing along the floor like it was looking for something else. And that's when the bubble I was in started to move. It had been on the edge of the pool before, above everything else that had happened. But now it started floating toward the center, between the two open trapdoors. I started panicking as it moved closer. I started trying to claw at the walls of the bubble, even though I knew it wouldn't do a damn bit of good. Behind the plexiglass, someone was watching the gifted with the electrodes in its head, tapping some handheld device and watching my progress along the floor of the pool. No one would meet my eyes. No one would look at me directly. The bubble stopped right in front of the thing, and it seemed to notice me for the first time. I wondered if I'd be able to pull the water from it between the moment when the bubble vanished and the moment it consumed me. I'd seen how fast it moved when it ate the other one, and I didn't think I would be fast enough. I didn't think I would have time to slow the scene. But still, I got ready. I decided to go down swinging. And then something happened. I didn't know what at the time. But someone in the control room shouted into a phone and waved his arms around, and everyone else stopped what they were doing to stare at him. And then they all turned to look at me, and then back at the man, and then at the creature circling my bubble. Whatever was happening, it was interfering with their plans. I didn't realize it at the time, but they had just gotten Shan's message. As the people in the room argued, the creature's movements started to get more agitated. It started clawing at the floor of the pool, circling the bubble, moving faster and faster. And then it took a leap at the bubble and bounced off. I didn't feel a thing. It went on like that for a few more minutes. The more agitated the thing in the pit got, the more frantic the people behind the glass were. One woman started crying. A man pulled at his hair and kicked a trash can across the room. People darted back and forth to the booth holding the gifted who was controlling my life. Most of the argument seemed to be centered there. The bubble, my status, what would happen to me next. I think that argument might have gone on forever, except that this creature in the pit stopped biting and scrabbling the walls and started gnawing on its own leg. It quivered and cringed and blood started to flow, but it kept trying to take a bite out of itself. The people in the control room panicked. One grabbed the controller for the gifted in the booth. Someone else punched him to take it away. Finally, the guy who seemed to be in charge said something that stopped all the other activity in the room. He pointed at me, pointed at the gifted, pointed up at the roof, and then he opened the door to the control room and jumped down into the pool. He landed and knelt there on the tiles and closed his eyes. The thing was on him in seconds. It was a quick death, this sacrifice. Quick, but not painless. The people in the control room screamed and hid their faces. Some of them threw up in the corners. He was respected, whoever this man was. As the creature devoured the rest of his body, my bubble started to rise back toward the ceiling. I passed through the ceiling, the roof, back up above the warehouse. I just hovered there for a while until some people came outside, got into a car, and drove away. The bubble started to move again then. I traveled much slower this time. I should mention at this point that I wasn't really thinking straight for that hours-long journey. Even if I hadn't mentioned the Mosaics, I'm sure you would have figured out by now what happened in that converted warehouse. You've probably put together what those things were. But at that point, I was just trying to get past what I'd seen. What it felt to be sure, absolutely sure, that I was about to die. Then there was the fact that I didn't know where they were taking me, if I was just buying a little more time. I didn't know if I was about to be fed to something much worse. I thought a lot about Shan as I floated through the sky. I thought about how I might never touch them again. I might never kiss them again. I realized it had been way too long since I told them I loved them. I had a lot of regrets up in that bubble. I'm not going to make those mistakes again. Finally, hours later, I touched down in a field outside a small village. I found out later it's part of the countryside outside Vienna. There were 3 figures alone in the middle of the grass. 2 of them were Shan and Iris. Iris was tied up, gagged, looking as haggard as I felt. Standing across from them was one of the men from the control room. The bubble settled on the ground next to him, then dissolved, letting me fall to the ground. For a second, I could barely move. The smell of grass and fresh air, the sight of Shan, was all too much. "This is a trade, Wren," Shan said. "Don't do anything. They have a sniper set up, aiming at you, and we've got Zachary out of sight, ready to take down Iris. We're all going to walk away from this." They reached over and undid Iris's gag. She stared right at me, her eyes wide and piercing. Then she turned to the man standing beside me. "Was it successful?" she asked. She didn't seem scared, just frantic, like she needed to know something. The man hesitated before he answered, looking over at me. "There were complications," he said, "since we couldn't use her. But it was successful." Iris smiled then, a wide, joyful smile. I wondered what could make her so happy in a moment like that. So happy that being kidnapped and tied up didn't even matter anymore. I thought back on what I'd seen in the warehouse, and I realized what all of you have already. I realized the one thing a member of the splinter would be prepared to sacrifice their life for. Those were the Mosaics, I said. That was them mating. It was perfect, I realized. All the genetic advantages of gifted people without any of the messy intelligence or free will. Just two creatures operating on pure animal instinct. A male to impregnate and die, a female to gestate and consume until the trumpet was born. They've already moved it, the man said quickly to Iris. She won't be able to tell them where it is, even if they find the original site. Iris nodded. I assume you found an alternative? Callum sacrificed himself. He was a good man, and we have some of the lower value gifteds ready for the next feeding cycle. Iris nodded. Not as good as a mosaic, but it should do. And I saw Shan's face settle into a mask of cold rage. Let's make this trade, Shan said, and pushed Iris harder than they had to. Iris and I passed each other as we crossed the field. Our eyes met for the briefest of moments, and then she joined her comrade, and I joined Shan. I wrapped my arms around them, breathing in their fresh, leafy scent. Are you okay? I asked. Yeah, they said. And you? Yeah. And then, in a low voice, I whispered in their ear, Where's the sniper? At your 5 o'clock, they said, kissing my cheek. I hugged Shan close to me and told them to keep low. Iris, I said, without turning to look at her. Yes, she said, and I could tell from the sound of her voice that she'd already started to move away. She'd already turned her back on me. That fool. I said, I want you to know that this isn't for Zachary, and it's not even for me. It's for the people you used to make those abominations I saw today. Iris realized what was happening. Take her, she started to say, before I pulled the water from her body and the body of her comrade. The sniper's bullets hit me a second later, one of them puncturing my lung and another blowing out my left kidney. It hurt like hell, but none of them went through, so Shan was safe, just like I planned. They pulled me to the ground until the last of the shots were fired, and we heard the tearing sound that meant Zachary had reached the sniper and taken their heat. Shan helped me sit up. I coughed up some blood, but I managed to massage out the bullet and push the shreds of my lung back together before I passed out. It's harder, repairing internal wounds, but I've had enough practice at this point. Iris's people made the mistake of assuming that the bullet I took to the leg a while ago was the only time I ever got shot, that it was the worst injury I've had to self-repair. It's not even close. There have been so many times I haven't shared in these messages, so much about my healing gifts I didn't want the splinter to know about. This wasn't the first time I've had an injury that would have killed a normal person, and it probably won't be the last. I've reattached my limbs. I've regrown most of my intestines. I've gotten 3rd-degree burns over half my body, and I was up and walking the next day. Couple of bullet holes? It's nothing. By the time Zachary reached us, my lung was back to normal and my kidney was on its way to working again. He stopped and stood over Iris's remains. I think he probably didn't know what to feel. He wanted her dead, of course, but he also wanted to be the one to do it. In the end, though, he just looked up at me and said, "Thank you." Shan helped me up. I took their hands in my own, and I told them the thing I'd been dreading. I told them I'd seen the Mosaics, that they had bred, that the female was pregnant with the trumpet. I told them I had failed to stop it while I was there. Zachary cursed and ranted and kicked at a rock as he heard the story. Shan just listened without a word until I was done. Then they said, "Well then, I guess we better get to work." And we did. We got back to the new headquarters, and I told Winry what happened, and she got started figuring out where that warehouse had been and where they could have moved the pregnant Mosaic. That's what we've been doing nonstop since I got back. I stopped to record this message for 2 reasons. First, I want the Splinter to know that their fearless leader is dead. I killed her, and I didn't even bother looking her in the eye while I did it. She was that unimportant at the end. The second reason I'm making this message is to ask any gifteds listening for your help. I don't know how long this thing needs to gestate. The mosaics they created were so far from human, I don't think we can assume we have 9 months. We need to move fast now. All of you gifteds out there, all of you who know about us and about the Splinter, everyone needs to move. Everyone needs to help us. We need to find out where they're keeping the mother of the Trumpet. Wait, what is that? Is that... Oh, no. Oh, God. That was it. That was the trumpet. Oh, my God. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Shit. It's all over. Spines is a production of Zoom Doom Stories. It's narrated by Wren Jones, written by Jamie Killen, website and logos by Benjamin Pond, produced by Jamie Killen and Benjamin Pond. You can support Spines by visiting patreon.com/Spines Podcast and by subscribing and leaving a review on iTunes. Spines is a member of Fatecrafters Studios. Find more great shows at fatecrafters.com. This week we recommend Public Domain Universe. We've all had the same thought when reading Voltaire. It's great and all, but I really just want to see Candide hunted in the world of the most dangerous game. And who hasn't wondered how Tom Sawyer would deal with the murder of Frankenstein? And now, with Public Domain Universe, you can listen to these and other modern-day adventures starring your favorite classic characters. With songs, laughs, and plenty of heart, it's like the best dreams you had in freshman English class. That's Public Domain Universe, available in your podcast app of choice.